I want to thank everyone for joining us on the eve of the eve, or the day of the eve of Yom Ha'Shoah. It is good to see you all locally and from a little further. It is just an incredible honor for me and a joy to welcome Paul Liptz back to North Shore Congregation Israel, even though, Paul, you're not physically in the building. I think this is, I don't know, your third or maybe fourth visit to us teaching here. And I'm not sure how many groups you've spoken to in Israel. I think the last group you and I worked with were my last team. Many of you, maybe all of you, I hope, have teachers in your life who are the teachers you cannot forget, because they are extraordinary in their pedagogy, their wisdom, and just who they are as humans. Well, for me and for so many of the colleagues, probably a little after Rabbi Mason's class and before Sarah Mason Barkin's class, Paul Liptz is that teacher. Paul is a social historian. He was on the faculty of Tel Aviv University for 40 years. He taught at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem for 25 years, where I first encountered him in a big lecture hall on a hot day in Jerusalem in the summer of 1990. And he taught a class called The Land and People of Israel. And ever since that, I have been hooked on the wisdom and insights of Paul Liptz. So we are thrilled. Paul is a social historian and focuses on the history of the Yishuv before the state, the modern state of Israel, and women and nationalism. And he's expanded his realm as he's taken on in the last, I don't know how many years, other parts of the world, Spain, and now we look at Poland today. Some of you just heard about Paul mention he's got 11 grandchildren, 4 kids, and we are grateful not only, Paul, to you for being here, but for Brenda, who I know is in the next room on call for tech as a tech expert. So Paul, thank you so much for being here. I turn the Zoom floor over to you. Thanks.
Good. Hi, good afternoon to everyone. It's good to be back at North Shore from afar. I have great memories of the times I was there. When discussing the topic that we should deal with today, we thought it would be a good idea not to deal with Shoah per se, because there are many other opportunities, but rather to try and look at what's going on in Poland. Life in Poland today is it's a broader topic. It's more than just today, but really essentially after the Shoah. So how did I get involved? And many of you may know Anne Lansky. I'd been interested in Shoah, and I'd been somewhat involved with Yad Vashem. And in 1991, Anne asked me to join a group of Chicago youngsters, and there were also 2 survivors from Chicago who joined us. It had a tremendous impact on me because I was told what I should know. I spoke to a number of people who'd been to Poland already. Israelis started going there about 5 or 6 years earlier. So we had a good few scholars who already knew the scene. And I was told, you don't have to learn anything about Auschwitz because there are guides there. So I did everything else but Auschwitz. I arrived, on the day we arrived there were 120 German buses who all arrived, and there were no guides in Auschwitz. So I had to guide Auschwitz without ever having been there and without really having studied it. That meant that I promised myself I would never go back. So, if anyone ever says never, you should just say it's the opposite is going to happen. And that's exactly what happened. So I've been there many, many times since, for one reason or the other, quite often with Reform temple groups from the United States. I learned a great deal from Pavel Stransky, who passed away a few years ago. He was an Auschwitz survivor from Prague, and we went together on one of my early trips. And every time I went back to Prague, where I've also visited several times, Pavel and I would sit together, and I think I got a very good sense of Poland and Auschwitz listening to Pavel again and again. And I know in Chicago, with a significant number of Holocaust survivors, I'm sure that's happened to many of you as well. I was at a limud, sort of limud, you probably know it. I describe it as an educational bonanza kind of thing. I was a limud in Warsaw. It was very interesting a few years ago to realize how different the Jewish community, generally the Jewish community is. Most of these sessions were in Polish, and the range of topics was quite unbelievable. That really convinced me that the country that I went to in 1990 was very different from the country that I visited about 5 or 6 years ago. Several Polish Jews, Reformed Jews, have attended seminars in Jerusalem. I became friends with them. Polish students at Tel Aviv University, people who, for example, involved in the museum in Warsaw, studying in Israel now in the international program, had long chats with them, non-Jewish people, young students, very interesting. Yad Vashem, as I mentioned, and then the vast amount of academic literature. Just to start off with one big question that everyone asks whenever you go to anywhere in Eastern Europe: how many Jews? Between 3,000, which is kind of the core group, essentially, most of them defining as Orthodox. Probably a closer figure is 30,000. Some people have told me 100,000, and others have even suggested that there are 200,000 potential Jews. We all know that in Poland, as with so many other Eastern European countries, people don't quite know, and I'll be relating to this a little later as well. And suddenly, for one reason or the other, the kind of standard is, when my grandmother was very ill, she said, "I've got one thing to tell you," and that starts those people's Jewish story. So there's certainly a Jewish population in Poland. I remember going there in the early 1990s. People said, you don't want to go there because you don't want to give your money to the Poles, but things have changed, not in every realm. What I'm going to try and do, by the way, is I'm going to try and deal, I want to concentrate on the Jewish community, but I'm going to definitely deal with what's going on around, because there's some very problematic events going on in Poland at the moment. You'll see on the bottom of every slide, there's my email. And why do I have my email so often on every slide? Because I always say when I'm meeting a group like yours, please feel free after we've ended this program, after we've finished the chat session, if you want to contact me, please do. Whatever your question, it doesn't really matter. I'm always available. I never feel that my job ends at the end of the hour or so. So after the Shoah, to 1996, there were a number of very important events. There were approximately, there had been about 3.3 million Jews. In 1945, there were about 380,000. By the way, in all figures that one's using, and it's true of Poland and other countries, there's always a question, were they local people or they come from other countries? So that's why you do have a kind of a confusion. Between 1944 and 1947, you have the first large exit, but you'll see that other people had come in. So the numbers go down with people emigrating, and numbers go up because people are coming from other areas of the world. I think the first event that really shocked the local Jewish population of that time was the Kirche pogrom in July 1946, which has been written about a great deal, and it had an unbelievable effect, not only as a result of the mob behavior. By the way, the little town is between Warsaw and Krakow, and you can see the picture there of the funeral of the 39 victims. But what you also have is immediately after that, a tremendous amount of people emigrating. It's a double tragedy, because here you often have Holocaust survivors who've wanted to come home. For a year, perhaps they felt they were home, then there was the pogrom, and then they found they were leaving. What existed from 1948 was the monument to the ghetto heroes, which I'm sure many of you have seen, both in Israel and in Warsaw. So the point is, wherever one has evidence of the Jewish presence, it might not be the human Jewish presence, but it might be the symbols of Jewish presence. 1949, yeshivas are closed down. The 50s have a high level of anti-Semitism. won't go into all the issues of communism and non-communism. And we can see from 55 to 1960, Aliyah to Israel obviously becomes the destination of the majority of people. Must remember, Israel in the 1950s was a pretty poor country. So some of them had even left better conditions in Poland than what they were going to find when they came to Israel. The big change was the Six-Day War. Things hadn't been good before 1967, but the Six-Day War brought a whole nother round of a tremendous amount of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union had been pro-Arabs. Our relationships with the Soviet Union, Russia in particular, hadn't been good during Stalin's period, but even after Stalin. And as a result of the Six-Day War and Israel's success, basically the Soviets had hoped that Israel would be defeated. Israel wasn't defeated. Israel found itself in a very strong position. There was this amazing exodus in March 1968, where we see that, you see over here, all the Jews are being described in many different ways. Jews were expelled from their jobs, and it was very, very difficult. In that period, for just about a 2-year period, 20,000 people left, of whom 13,000 went to Israel. So what we're really finding, if we take the period 1945 to 1967, is a period of tremendous insecurity for the Jewish population. And what we must always remember, I think often, I know when I'm speaking to younger students, Israelis and those from other countries, I'd always get the question, well, why didn't they go somewhere else? You have to remember that emigration, you're seeing it in the United States, emigrating from your own country in crisis to another country isn't always easy. So it really was only in extreme situations that you would suddenly find in the late 60s, 20,000 people suddenly getting up and going, in some cases, to a totally unknown situation. What did the Jews do during that period? Well, they were severely oppressed, but they took little actions, which I think are very significant. For example, there's the very interesting case in 1977 of the Jewish Flying University. And this was just some sort of a desperate attempt to carry on studying. Whatever you do, study. The realm of studies was very broad. It was in a Judaic realm. It was sometimes about Jewish history, sometimes about Israel. The study program was usually in little apartments and very dangerous, because if the authorities found out that if they were studying Judaism, that was described as Zionism. So whatever they were doing was very, very dangerous. But I think we're beginning to see the sign of 1979 is really very much the determination of the Jews who remained in Poland to somehow or other carry on what they were doing. The bump, once again, ups and downs. 2000, Poland is in the post-Soviet period. People very much believed that this was going to change the reality. And Jan Gross came out with 2 unbelievable books. The better known one came out in 2000, Neighbors, and then in 2008, Fear. Both books had much greater influence than one could ever imagine. And in fact, although I'm talking here about 2 books, some published some years ago, the question of Jan Gross is totally contemporary in Polish society until today. Neighbors is about Jedwabne. I've been to Jedwabne. In fact, had a very interesting visit there. I was with a group of HUC students. We arrived in Jedwabne. It's a little town, not too far from Warsaw. And we actually, by chance, at the memorial, there's a little memorial site there, there was a Polish gentleman who now lives in the United States. And he had come back to visit Jedwabne. Now, the Polish government for years and years and years, from the early period, from the 1940s until today, still denies that the Poles were directly involved in the mass murder of the Jewish population. We'll talk about the latest issues just a little later. But Jedwabne brought up the debate, and it was well researched. It's if you haven't read the book, I would recommend it. It's better, I think, as a learning book than Fear. But Fear, by the way, we see very quickly sold an amazing amount. 50,000 books on Fear were sold because the issue was so very, very broad. In 2008, with the book Fear coming out, there was the question of loyalty. Are you loyal to your country when you criticize it? And are you loyal as an historian, as an academic, when you bring up embarrassing components of past history? This is an unbelievably sensitive issue. I think, you know, for those of us who are living in the United States or Israel, embarrassing events of history come up easily. In the case of Poland, this is causing a tremendous amount of problem. And there was a Polish prosecutor who actually supported Gross, and he was demoted. So we're beginning to see that the intervention of the Polish government in historical and academic affairs and in legal affairs has become very, very serious. And as we see, although it's many years since the two books were published, the Polish government still is considering taking up action against him and a number of other people who I'll mention a little later. What's happened and I've seen it again and again, going back to Poland, whenever I would go back and I was going to be the scholar for an American or some other group, I would always try and go there a day or two before and sit down and speak to some of my friends there. Some of them are tour guides, some of them academics, some of them I just know from other realms. And what we have from 2015, so it's a period of 6 years now, is the very, very aggressive approach of the Law and Justice Party, which is the governing party, the PIS, which has been supported by more radical groups. There are a number of very, very radical groups, and they, together with the government, have become very important. We see this picture there of the 2017 demonstration. 60,000 people are in these mass right-wing ethno-nationalist fascist groups. Also with certain church members, not all church members, obviously. And this really leads to the 2018 Polish Holocaust laws, which we totally part of until the present time. And what we actually seeing here is very, very clearly that it is forbidden to use the term Polish concentration camps, because that would suggest, as far as the Polish government is concerned, that Poles established the concentration camps. Now, in a sense, one can understand the Polish government's sensitivity. The Poles have often mentioned to me, non-Jewish Poles who I've met in Poland, have often said there's something very unfair that's happened. It's as if the Poles were the initiators of the Second World War, which we know that was not the case in September 1939, that they set up the concentration camps, which is obviously incorrect. So they themselves have a certain case, and they are extremely sensitive. They constantly say, I constantly hear it from the Polish side, that they are not guilty, they were the victims. And the idea that the Jews are the ultimate victims, in a sense, is threatening to them. Bibi Netanyahu got involved in some of the issues that were going on. And Netanyahu, for political reasons, he has a colleague, he's a colleague of many of the right-wing governments, Polish government, Hungarian government, Brazilian, Indian, many other governments of the right. And he really very much wanted to ensure that Poland was a good friend of Israel, and although he's not a right-wing in the same as the Polish government, he is certainly a right-wing person. Deborah Lipstadt came out with a very, very strong statement saying that Netanyahu is actually playing the game in favor of the Polish government and not abiding by what historical research is increasingly shown. In terms of radical right-wing views, Radio Maria heard a great deal about it as a populist and xenophobic radio station. It doesn't have a large audience, but it has a very significant, most of the audience are elderly people. And I was speaking to a woman whose grandmother, she tells me, listens to Radio Maria all the time. Radio Maria is totally against the foreigner. And for Radio Maria, which although it isn't a mass radio, but it is still listened to by a fairly large amount of people, very, very much builds on an ongoing level, ongoing basis, the concept of the Jew and the foreigner. So this is, through history, has always been very problematic. And here we see it happening once again. The issue of the right-wing government of the Law and Justice Party came up again. And sorry, did it come up? Yeah, come up again and again. And this is with the Warsaw Uprising Museum. That was the first stage. It's 2004. It's a very good museum, by the way. But what is lacking in the museum is the Jewish story. It's kind of just not there. It's a well organized museum. But, you know, I could leave it in that sense because it is trying to give the Polish story of the Polish Warsaw Uprising, not the Jewish one. But then you have various institutes. The Pilchi Institute is created, it's perceived by its critics as an out-and-out propaganda mechanism. And within this whole realm is the latest argument, which has been vociferous, is that in 2023, 2 years' time, the Warsaw Ghetto Museum is to be set up. And its head is the chief historian is Daniel Blattman. Have to tell you just a little bit what happened with Daniel Blattman. Daniel Blattman's a well-known professor at the Hebrew University, and he has come under attack in a way that, you know, I cannot remember for an extended period of time. I've been in Israel almost 54 years. I just cannot remember any academic debate or situation where anyone has been as attacked as Blattman is. And the feeling is, and this is broadly represented by the overwhelming amount of serious historians, that Blattman is totally under the influence of the Polish authorities. Now, what's important about this? The important thing is this is an Israeli Jew who is essentially following the thesis, the perspective of the Polish government. And this has therefore been a very, very sensitive issue. Yad Vashem in particular came out with a powerful statement. The debates went on in the media and in the newspapers day after day, as I said, in a sense that I've never seen anything like it before. And recently in January 2021, Forward magazine came out with a very important article by people, Jews, most of them in America, who were also very worried by the direction that the Warsaw Ghetto Museum will be presenting. Let's go to the Jewish side. What's there as far as Jewish history and Jewish events are concerned? So Okupova Street's Jewish Cemetery, I remember the years when I used to go to Warsaw, and there was absolutely almost nothing to see except this particular cemetery, very large, resting place of over 200,000 people, approximately 80,000 graves with inscriptions. You see a part of the picture there. And I think what's been interesting that when one looks, say, at the mid-1990s or even the year 2000, and one sees how little there was generally in Poland of the Jewish story, and we see where it is now. So why I don't want to deny for a moment the seriousness of the position of the government and the authorities. I think it's also to remember that certain important things are happening from the Jewish perspective, of which in 2017, there was a expectation and a promise by the government to restore the cemetery. And for those of you who visited over the years, you probably remember the days when you could hardly go down 3 or 4 lanes, but now you can literally walk not to the very end, but almost to the end. Interesting event when I was there once were non-Jewish volunteers, both local and overseas. The particular picture that I have there is a similar group that you have often of non-Jews turning up from various parts of the world, trying to contribute in one way or the other, in some cases in situations which I find difficult to deal with. I've been asked by Polish Christians to forgive them for what happened. And it's not a kind of a realm that I even know how to start to deal with. But the fact that you do find these volunteers, Christian volunteers, going around to Warsaw, I've saw it near Lublin and other places, I think has significance. The 1946 Jewish Historical Institute was established or re-established, an amazing institute. I mean, in the very, very modest building that they have and fairly limited budget, they really have done some excellent work. And again and again, I look at the work of their genealogy program, people writing from all over the world, wanting to learn about their families, and to just hear again and again, kind of the possibility of getting information. If any of you do want information, this is certainly one of the places you should go to. There's also the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute, which is trying to do what it can to preserve the Polish memory. I once gave a presentation at the Institute. It was very interesting. The audience was a broad group of people, fascinated and wanting to learn. And this, to me, is not only in Poland, but in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, when I meet Jewish and non-Jewish people who craving for knowledge, craving for education, you know, that really does gives one a good feeling in situations which are often so desperate. The Nojek synagogue in Warsaw has been through ups and downs. Originally built in 902, holds about 600 people altogether. It was damaged, it was in a terrible condition. Afterwards, it was rebuilt, and at a certain time, it was even attacked by arsonists, but it's a very viable synagogue. I just want to tell you one event that I remember very strongly in the 1990s. We were in the synagogue on Shabbat, and there were 2 audiences, local audiences. There were some outsiders as well, foreigners as well, but there were 2 local audiences. One were the elderly men who had been going back to the synagogue and been permitted by the government for a considerable number of years. But there were some young Polish men, because the women were upstairs, and I was only involved in the men at that moment. The young Polish men got involved in a vicious argument with the elderly of what's the right way to pray. And just watching this kind of revealed in such a powerful way the tensions. The elderly men had kept praying, had kept Judaism going in very difficult conditions. It wasn't what the young men who had studied, we're talking here about Orthodox young men who thought that that's what Judaism is all about. But it was just this powerful moment, this meeting of these 2 generations, which was very, very painful. And generally speaking, although the Orthodox community is the dominating community, they've got 8 rabbis, there's something in the region of 1,200 members by some definition or the other. There are tough relationships between Chabad, the modern Orthodox, and the progressive, the Reform movement, which I'll speak about in more detail a little later. But 2014 was a major moment. The setting up of the museum, the Polin Museum, was just really a very, very significant event. There are a number of things that I think one has to put into it. You may well have been there. Pauline from the Hebrew, here, Paulan, here rest, is possibly the name. That's what we'd like to think. But was the cooperation of the municipality, the government, and local and overseas donors, particularly the Taube Foundation. Tremendous amount of funds, and the building, as you probably many of you know, in the central part of Warsaw, in that area where the monument had been set up in 1949. I must admit, before I went into the museum the first time, I was totally convinced it was going to be a kind of a propaganda museum. I spoke, I was there for dinner on a Friday night at the Reform Synagogue, and I was speaking to a Polish historian, a non-Jewish person, and he said it was just about to open, and he promised me that I would be impressed with it. You know, listening, am I really going to be impressed with it? Kind of seems to be a government-oriented museum, but I think it's outstanding. Any way you look at it, one can disagree with some components or others, but it's been very good until recently. Recently, the government has once again got involved, and that's very, very worrying, because until now, and I get this information from young Polish non-Jews who were my students at Tel Aviv University, who would tell me that until very recently they had a free hand, and they wanted to be guides. The non-Jewish people wanted to be guides because they felt it would be very important. And yet recently I'm hearing from various sources that there's a creeping government intervention in what's going on. What's Jewish life in Warsaw? From the Warsaw, as I mentioned, that I used to see, it's a totally different Warsaw. Well, there was always the State Jewish Theater. Interesting, they would play in Yiddish, non-Jewish people speaking Yiddish. There'd be a translation above into Polish. The definition of a Jew in Warsaw, and I mention it because this is an ongoing controversy right around the Jewish world, is that you can become a member of the Jewish community. It's an organized framework. At least one Jewish grandparent or has undergone Reform or Orthodox conversion, that person becomes a member. And I think here we see something which is actually very important. By the way, if you didn't have this open-minded definition, I don't know what your number would actually be of involved people. There had been Yiddish language courses starting from 1988, not for a large number of people. The Lauda Morisha School, which I'd visited on a number of occasions, amazing venture. The Lauda family has been very, very involved in supporting Poland and Polish Jewry in other parts of the world as well. Most of the students that I met then, and it's true until today, are non-Jewish students. It's a good private school. But the fact that we were getting off the ground was interesting. On my early visit, I wrote to them and I said, what can I bring? So they gave me a list of kind of kosher food to buy. You just couldn't find it there. In the 1990s, if you only ate kosher, you were in a tough situation. It's obviously a lot better now. And the JCC, I absolutely love the JCC. Every time I'm in that building, it buzzes. It's a small building, you can see it. It's really a tiny building. In each little room, there's activity. It buzzes almost all the time. As I say, I've been there on a number of occasions. It's very, very broad in terms of their activities. You can see some of the issues, their lectures. There's Chagim, there's film festivals, there's a Hebrew library, learning Hebrew, Hebrew dances, and everything else. Everything under the sun, effervescent. And I'm kind of finding myself, because for many years I was involved with the World Union for Progressive Judaism, we would every now and again get caught by this decision, where does one invest one's energy? And for some reason now, Poland was quite low down on the totem level. There were other cases which seemed much more viable. The Polish government was disturbing how certain Jewish people involved in Jewish affairs felt about it. But I would always say to them, if you want to feel the buzz of the young Jewish community go to the two JCCs, which I'll be mentioning. And it really is a wonderful program, in addition to which the Nissenbaum Foundation has also been very important. What makes things buzz as well is Krakow. Krakow is an amazing place. The very first time I just, my memory is so strong of my early visits. I went into the old shul there, and there were 5 elderly Jews. This was 1991. And it was so depressing. When they found out that I was an Israeli, and that for some reason or other, they didn't seem to have met any other Israelis, they plucked up and ended up by being a kind of a nice little discussion. But it was clear to me as I went to the Orthodox synagogue in Krakow, and in the later years, the Reform one was developed, but in the early years was only the Orthodox. What amazed me of synagogue services and Erev Shabbat was the fact that the service, I couldn't follow the Hebrew. And that shouldn't be a problem for me. Just couldn't follow it. It was said so fast. And the service, I maybe 3/4 of an hour at the very most, or sometimes maybe even less. And then people ran out. And I couldn't understand it until I turned around to someone and I said, what's going on? He said, these people, this is what they've been doing for years and years and years. You don't stick around in the synagogue too long. The synagogue I'm talking about is very different from the temple. This beautiful building, it is just unbelievable. It was originally a Reform building. I won't go into the complexities of properties at the moment, but it's absolutely beautiful today, and it's used relatively rarely for Jewish events, but it's kind of a cultural center now. But the big buzz, obviously, for many, many people is what started in 1988, and that was the Jewish Culture Festivals, about 30,000 participants. I've been to 2 of them, and it's just unbelievable. I mean, I constantly ask myself what's happening. Some of the people are there because it's just a great festival. There's a lot of charisma and a lot of nice music, but there are lectures and dancing and many other things that are going on. I spent some time talking to the festival director, terrific guy. I mean, once again, I'm so impressed. A country like Poland has got off the ground because of a handful of people. It's quite amazing how you begin to see some of these things having got off the ground. And he's not Jewish, but he absolutely considered himself a Zionist. He couldn't believe that I wouldn't accept him fully as a Zionist, and I certainly do accept him as a Zionist. You can see the picture of the crowd. The crowd, you can hardly get in, by the way. On both occasions, I remember the second occasion we were just a little bit late, and before we found seats for ourselves, it really took a long time. The Poles are interested in it. I'm not making it sound nice, but this is okay, because I've still got some very tough comments to make about what's also going on in Poland, besides these kind of events, which you have to take everything into consideration. In Krakow, there's the Galicia Jewish Museum, lovely, produced by 2 a photojournalist and a scholar. Amazing, beautiful Jewish museum. I love it for many reasons. It's a picture of another world of Jewish life in the whole of the Galicia area, a large area in Poland and part of other countries at other times in history. I like it I think it's the best Jewish bookshop on Poland in the world. So I always go there and use it. I've once again also given a session or 2 there. They're very open, very, very willing. I mean, I found it wonderful to be able to go into as an outsider into their territory and be welcomed in the way that I have been welcomed. In Krakow, if I remember, mentioned the Warsaw JCC, the Krakow JCC is even more amazing. It was opened by the Prince of Charles. We see him got the hammer about to put in the mezuzah. It has about 8,000 visitors per month. The person behind it is this guy sitting over here, Jonathan Ornstein. Jonathan is a character. I mean, that's the only way I can describe him. I've sat and listened to him. He has pretty much the same speech every time, but every single time that I hear him, I enjoy it as much as the time before. He is so enthusiastic. And what they do, it's very interesting because I'll mention academic studies in a moment, but a lot of the people who work at the JCC, it's this nice building, by the way. It's not this whole area. This is more or less, you can see my cursor. This is more or less the end of the building. It's 3 floors with a very small elevator. So it's a place that you end up by doing a lot of walking. Many of the people who work there, who volunteers there, are non-Jewish students who are involved in Jewish studies at the local Krakow University. On Friday night, you can see this, you can see this big picture in the garden, maximum use of space. By the way, that's the expression that I was thinking of earlier. Maximum use of space is what I feel every time I'm going to one of these institutions in Krakow. And here in the garden, certainly not in the winter, because in the Polish winter, you certainly don't want to be outside. It's something like Chicago. The open areas for Friday night services are absolutely amazing. And every time I go there, there's 1 or 2 other Jewish areas, kosher hotel. I've stayed in one of the hotels there, and a new prayer house, which went up a few years ago. Interesting kind of things. Jewish studies. How does one get the Jewish story to the wider population? Population, which I say is still to a large extent anti-Semitic. So I've taken a few of the realms. There are a few universities which have Jewish studies. Many of the academic staff are non-Jewish, but when I've spoken to them at various places, they're very involved in Israel, and many of them have studied in Israel. They find it important. And I don't think it's just about an exotic studies. I think it's very, very serious stuff is going on. Here we find the beautiful, beautiful Krakow Jagiellonian University. It's a beautiful campus, and that they have a very large number of students. Over here we have the Anna Levitch Center of Warsaw Museum. Here we have the Wrocław Center, which I've actually never been to. And here we have the Lublin, which is a beautiful town and a lovely center there. Why are Polish students studying Jewish topics? I've just put down there, and I know this is being recorded, so I'm not relating to all of it, but the research shows us, and we have good research today on it, that there's a vast number of reasons why Polish students are going to learn. By the way, it's not going to be financially worthwhile for them. How many jobs are there going to be in the Jewish arena for non-Jewish people? Maybe a little bit at the Polish Museum, but really not adequate. There's a searching that's going on, and in addition to which we see about 100 books are coming out a year, and there's certainly forum for dialogue for schools, which is, I understand it's quite successful. Just quickly, a few other things. The Chachmei Lublin Museum, Yeshiva, I'm sorry. It was set up in the 1930s. It was where the Daf Yomi for the Talmud was set up. It was then taken over by the Nazis. It was later the medical university. When I actually went there the first time, I gave a lecture in the medical university, in the forum, the main classroom that the School of Medicine had initially used. It was returned to the Jewish community in 2013, 2007. The mikveh was found. That was always a very exciting thing. It was going to be a Jewish center. The Jewish community is small. Not all that many visitors go to Lublin. And in 2014, it became Hotel Ilan, which has a nice explanation around it about the story. Where's Reform Judaism? Pushing itself forward, trying terribly hard. some very devoted people. Chaim Beliak from Los Angeles is head of Bet Polska, which is the kind of the umbrella organization. There are 7 communities of different sizes of the Reform movement. Bet Varshava, which was set up with Severin Ashkenazi, which is this building over here. I've slept there on a number of occasions. Severin has been very helpful to the Reform movement. Now they've rented in Warsaw City. There was a break-off kind of movement of Stas. Stas is originally from the Soviet Union. It's a progressive synagogue, but it's connected to the religious community. It has a progressive reform approach, but it's part of the wider community. We have interesting people here. We have Rivka, very lively cantor. And unfortunately in Krakow, the sad part is small little community using the Galicia Museum. They've split for reasons which are very problematic. Getting towards the end is a book that I would recommend for anyone who wants to learn about what's happening in terms of what are called third post-Holocaust generation Jews. Fascinating book, came out in 2013. I just want to concentrate on the red areas. It's very much about reconciling 2 identities, Polish and Jewish. What I think is very important, because I'm going to contradict myself a little later, is that within the sources, in the research which has been done, and it's primary sources of young people who identify with the Jewish community in one realm or the other, state quite often, and this is the interesting part about the book, that they feel a philo-Semitism, the love of the Jew, rather than anti-Semitism, which is often the realm that's that we read about. Very interesting sub-stories, a story of a woman who went to Tvarda, which is the Orthodox synagogue, didn't feel at ease there, joined the Reform group and feels much more comfortable. Fascinating book. It would take a lecture in itself just to go through that. Activities about Jews very quickly. Łódź, Lublin has its own group. Daffodils, I was there twice during the Daffodils period, which is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and non-Jewish people walking around with the yellow daffodil. It's very emotional, very powerful. And you also have this beautiful building over here, which for about 6 hours, it's about 2 hours, sorry, I thought it was a bit longer. Gabi von Zeltman, she's Jewish. She married a non-Jewish man whose grandfather was an SS officer. It's a whole story in itself. Gabi's a very talented person. I was on the phone, on the Zoom with her a little while ago. She puts up this picture on the building that was originally the Great Synagogue, and it appears on this old building. It's now a beautiful structure, actually, and that's kind of to try and explain the story of the Jews in yet one other way. The brave Polish intellectuals, unbelievable. This thing which is going on now with Jan and Dagmara is about the night without an end. It's a whole long story. I won't go into the intricate details, but there's a minor event of this massive book which has been kind of taken out, and it's demanded that they apologize. Jan was on a Zoom session a while ago, and a very serious threat to open intellectual analysis, not only by Jewish intellectuals, but non-Jewish intellectuals who are very committed to telling the story. And this is the problematic. I want to end with this, because on the one hand, I've given I think, a positive and optimistic approach. Good things are carrying on in Poland. There's the side. And even though I just mentioned that philo-Semitism is felt by many of the, I don't know what we'd call them, people who now define themselves as Jewish, is some of the research. 2004, only 3% were ashamed of the negative attitude towards Jews in World War II. The 2009 Polish survey conducted says that 73%, a high percentage, feel proud about what they did for the Jews during the war. The Cantor Center of Tel Aviv University has written all the years. In 2018, it came out with a particularly strong statement of anti-Semitism in vast numbers of realms. And just to include with the November 2019 ADL, Anti-Defamation League Global Seminar, Anti-Semitism Survey, 48% of all polls have been described by the ADL as anti-Semitic. It's an interesting survey. I don't want to just go into too much. Men much more than women. By the way, we often see men more anti-Semitic than women in Europe, but the gap is tremendous. Something perhaps a little bit encouraging. It's lower among the 18 to 34-year-olds, higher among the 50 plus. So this is somewhere a hope for the future. Here we see some of the details. The ADL survey is always available on the internet. You can look at the whole situation. To end just on a very personal comment, after many visits to Poland, I've never experienced anti-Semitism, but I'm in a confined, defined realm. Obviously, I'm not going out to the wider society. I'm not going to the outlying villages where things are very different from the larger cities. But I would certainly take this factor of government anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish and anti-intellectual activity as being very important. Certainly the surveys that I've represented here, and at the same time, and I think one can live within this apparent ambivalence at the same time to remember that the people who are there, the Jewish community who are there, and the people who committed to helping the Jewish community from the outside their religious views are doing some remarkable things. And I think as we go into Yom Ha'Shoah, this powerful event, somewhere at the back of our minds, I think for me, it's always important as I think of Yom Ha'Shoah, to know that in some countries in Eastern Europe, the Jews are still living there. I think we should still help them as much as we can. That's what I was doing within the World Union for Progressive Judaism. And I think we must see them as our brethren, as part of our larger family. So I'll stop share now and go on to Rabbi Green.
Trouble unmuting. Paul, do you have a few minutes for questions? Are you? Oh.
No, I'm happy to deal with any questions that anyone has.
Okay, well, if folks have questions, you can raise your hand either physically or through the screen. I would ask you to limit your questions to questions as opposed to statements. So we can be respectful of everyone's time, including our scholars. Paul, I know you addressed it, but I'm still struggling with like the culture festival and things like that. I mean, do you feel like that's real, or do you feel like it's like the festival of like, to some people, like the dead language, the dead, like the old Prague Museum, the Nazis are.
For some, it's an exotic ethnic festival. I've no doubt about it. Look, they're very let me deal with, for example, the tensions of the festival. I think people who go there are interested in Jewish topics. They're interested in Yiddish music, by the way. You know what I found quite interesting about the festival? I think there are a number of Poles who actually want to recapture their Polish past through the Jewish story. It's a very interesting event. I've seen it with a number of Polish academics who I've met. And I said, when did you come involved with Jewish issues? And they said, I'm a Polish historian. And I'm looking at the 15th and 16th century. And what do I keep finding? Jewish sources, because Jews were always so much more literate than the local population. So you have this, I think it's not a cynical event, but I do think part of it is, and this is what the researcher shows us, I think, part of it is this whole kind of situation of, I want to know who I am as a Pole. And I have to realize that a big part of me being Poland is the Jewish story, because it was a significant number of people, 30% in Warsaw. So I think the festival has to be put into that component. The 30,000 people there are not going to learn about the Jewish world, but they want to learn about it as a Polish Jewish event. And I think that's significant. So I find it exciting, and I feel the vibes there are very, very, very important. So that's what I really do feel about the festival.
Fascinating. Thanks. Erin, did you have a question? Erin, I'm not sure you had a question. You are muted, however. No? Okay.
I found some people don't know how to use the mute.
Jim, you have a question?
Yeah. He has to take off the mute.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Jim.
How are you, sir? Excellent summary. To what extent will the Israeli business community develop independent and joint ventures with Poland, which would bring a closer relationship between the two countries? There's a couple levels advanced in technology and so on, and they don't have to transfer much to be of large improvement in Poland.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's a certain amount of business and technological kind of interaction. I know it exists on a certain amount. Certainly when I'm traveling over, it's always clear that there are a bunch of of Israeli business people there. I think for the Poles, by the way, they're much more interested in what's going on in Germany. That means the development that has happened in Poland has essentially come about because of the German intervention, which is strange, because on the one hand, you would imagine that there would be great anger towards Germany. The reason it came about, that there were 3-day tours of Poland of Germans coming in the 1950s when the Polish economy was in a terrible situation. And that, I think, established the early kind of investment. You find IBM and companies like that were very quickly put up in Warsaw. So I think that has been kind of the initial development of a relationship. I have a feeling, by the way, that the position is going to develop as time goes by. And I mean, we're seeing right around the world that Israeli venture capital, the startup nation, is slowly moving into other countries. From what I know, the Israelis don't look at Poland as a prime target, but it is there. So I'm not quite sure of the exact trade figures, but I think it's got somewhere. It has to still develop. I would put it that way. Thank you for the question.
Interesting. Thanks, Jim. Rabbi Mason, and then Eric, and then Mitch.
I would mute.
I actually don't have a question, just 2 observations. Back in the fall of 2014, a pretty significant group of folks from NSCI were in Poland. And I want to just mention 2 things we saw. I ran into, I don't know if any of the others do or remember it, some Israelis who were involved in commercial real estate and development around Warsaw, building shopping centers and things like that.
Yeah.
But when you travel to places like Poland or the Czech Republic, it sometimes feels like you are touring a world that was. That is the case, but I will never forget how vibrant the experience was we had in Krakow. We were at Kabbalat Shabbat services with the Reformed congregation that met in the museum and then had a Shabbat dinner, I would say a rollicking Shabbat dinner at that JCC, just sort of to underscore what Paul has just said about that, because the Jewish rebirth, the Renaissance there among a group of people is really and truly inspiring. So, Paul, I want to thank you for
Yeah.
reminding me of that.
Thank
Really,
you.
truly.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with you. You know, you bring it back to me, this Galicia Museum. It's kind of, I'm sure you probably found it a little strange. You go in there, you see all these rather depressing pictures, and that's where you're having a tefillah. But it's very powerful. And as you say, the connection and then going for the meal to the JCC, it's a very powerful experience. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the reform group in Krakow has gone through some internal crisis. But these are things that we have to help. You know, I constantly have this feeling that, you know, those of us in the two countries, Israel and America, I really feel that we have to commit ourselves to helping the smaller communities of the world. And, you know, that's still the challenge. But I do remember, now that you mentioned there have been land estate, and some Israelis are involved in hotels. Hotel Ilan, for example, in Lublin has some Israeli involvement. But to thank you for, I think, strengthening the feeling that I myself felt at the Galicia Museum and the JCC. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Aaron, and then Mitch, and then Chuck, and then we'll.
Thank you for the interesting talk. It was really nice to see Itzhak Perlman playing klezmer music in Krakow Festival. It was incredible. The other thing is there is a Rhodesia Museum and Archives in Warsaw, and it's very well kept. And you can go there, and they have a list of the German archives where you can look at your relatives and see their names, where they were sent to, where they died from. Is a really meticulously kept by the Germans, and is really impressive for anybody who wants to know. And finally, that cemetery still needs a lot of work to be done, a lot of work, because many of the stones are down. You know, they stole some of the material. Needs a lot of work to be done yet.
You know, you bring up a very important point, and that is what I didn't mention: the vast number of cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, right through Poland. And wherever you travel, more or less, you come to these graveyards which have been untouched. And you know, it's a very, thank you very much for bringing up your point, because I think it's this major question of how you allocate your funds. Do you work on the cemeteries, which is very important, or do you work on education, or do you work on, you know, whatever realm it is? But I remember once being with a group of youngsters in Poland, and we went to a cemetery, and I think we did afterwards, I thought we did something terrible. We tried to clean it up. All we were doing was moving these gravestones, and in many cases, we actually broke them. So, you know, afterwards I said, oy vey gewalt, what's really going on here? What have we done? But it's a kind of, and some sort of attempt to help. And I agree with you. There's a lot to do. But the Okopowa in Warsaw, I don't know when you were there last time, they're slowly working on it. And it's now than it was 20 years ago. So, you know, hopefully every year things get a little bit better. I think that's what we have to believe in. Thank you for your comment.
Thanks, Aaron. Mitch Mackman. You're muted.
I'm muted.
Mitch, could you unmute, please? We want to hear what you have to say. Good.
Sorry, I'll repeat. First of all, thank you for this illuminating discussion and seeing your happy face. It's nice. Speaking of the Jewish cemeteries in Poland, are you familiar with a gentleman by the name of Witold Rosinski, who I understand has prepared an index of all the headstones of all the Jewish cemeteries in Poland, and is devoting his time to that work? Just curious if you know this person. And the reason I'm asking too is we had a family trip planned for
really?
March, I think 12th of last year.
I don't know, you know, I know that there are 3 or 4 books which already
Planning
exist.
to go again. And this gentleman is, we'd like to have as our guide. And I just want to know if you had any insight.
I personally don't know, but I know they've done tremendous amount of work on this particular project. So, you know, I don't know him personally, but it sounds a great idea that someone who's done that research to meet up with him. If he's not available, you know, the people at the Jewish Historical Institute, they're very well informed in terms of, you know, who's in the field of the various components of Polish history. So you can always ask them as well. So hope you have a good trip when you eventually get there.
That's the connection.
Good. Which part of Poland would you go to?
We were going to Krakow, Warsaw, and then to Biała Podlaska, right near Lublin, I believe.
I don't know where it is.
Which is where my grandfather grew up.
That's amazing, Mitch.
Yeah. So we hope to get back, and looking forward to it. So hopefully, I don't know what the situation there is.
Sure.
International travel there, but
good. Have a good trip. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. I'll be curious to hear more.
Yeah.
There was one other, Chuck Friend, the last question I think was you. Go ahead.
Oh, as usual, I learned so much from you. But are most of the younger Polish Jews, were their grandparents in Poland pre-Shoah Poles, or were they immigrants from other countries, Germany, Russia, or other countries?
Thank you, Chuck. For both, by the way, some were old timers there. You know, there was a tremendous movement through Europe over the years. So you have some people, you know, whose grandparents may have been there in the 1920s and then they went to another country. So the answer is that you have just about everything. And the research, which I mentioned, the one book in particular, but there are other sources as well, show that there are so many stories there. It's kind of like each person is a world in her or himself. It's quite amazing. So when you get these studies being done, you'll find exactly the 2 realms which you've mentioned, both sort of indigenous Polish people at one time or the other, maybe not during all the periods, and some of them who, as you mentioned, came in from other countries, particularly Eastern Europe, by the way, from Russia and places like that, after the end of the Second World War. Some people, by the way, trying to get to the West, and they didn't manage to get further than Poland. So you have, you know, multi-level sub-stories as well. So I found, I mean, I've been interested in this story now essentially for 30 years. And I must say that every single time I read a new source, it's as if a new world has started. So it's really a fascinating, very tragic story. But at the same time, as Rabbi Mason mentioned, it's an effervescent society, you know. 2014, it was great. And now, when I was there a year ago, even more so.
Amazing. I was last in Krakow in 1994, and there were a few pictures and signs for like a Schindler's List tour, which was beyond spooky, and we walked around looking at doorposts where
nothing
this is out. A long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm just looking at the date for next week. Thank you, Paul, for teaching us, challenging us to thinking about our relationships with the Jews in Poland, and thinking about our history as well. I think to Mitch's question and others, it pushes many of us back to think about what we know or don't know and what the connections are. thrilled, appreciate you all join us, have joined us this week, and Paul will be joining us the same time, same bat channel as it were, next week, April 14th at noon, for a session called Israeli Independence, Its Declarations and Dreams, Its Realities Now. So that will be on the eve of Yom Ha'Shoah, Israel Independence Day. And Paul, we look forward to returning back with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everyone for
Thank you
joining
so
us.
much.